and good day. My name is Dee DeShawn, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of the Ann Arbor area, which serves all of Washtenaw County. I'll be your moderator today for our monthly Lunch and Learn session. Before I introduce our guest today, here's a bit about us. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan civic organization that encourages informed and active participation by all citizens. The League works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and seeks to strengthen and broaden our knowledge about our form of government and democracy. While the League does not support candidates or parties, we do take stands on issues that we have studied. The advocacy committee of our local chapter plays an important role in determining what issues and topics we want to educate citizens about. Thus, the issue of voting rights, which is very much in the news and on our minds, is the topic of today's Lunch and Learn. University of Kentucky law professor Josh Douglas is the author of Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Professor Douglas is widely considered to be one of the most important voting rights experts in the country. His book chronicles grassroots voting rights reforms that support the right of citizens to vote. Professor Douglas has appeared on CNN discussing the election system and the kind of reform efforts that he believes can make voting more accessible, reliable, and effective. His writing and commentary has appeared in the New York Times, Politico, USA Today, the Washington Post, Reuters, and Slate Magazine, above others. Your host today is Joan Sampieri, the president of our Ann Arbor area chapter, who will interview Professor Douglas about his book and the current state of proposed voting laws. Joan, over to you.
Thank you, Dee. Well, Professor Douglas, Michigan saw great strides toward what the League and others consider a level playing field in 2018 by passing 2 constitutional amendments. One created a citizens commission designed to remove redistricting of congressional and state legislative districts from the political process. The second broadened and strengthened access to voting for Michigan citizens. Both of those were citizen-led successes, similar to what you talk about in your book, Vote for Us. And we see on the horizon some really worrisome attempts that may well be successful in narrowing those successes. You're generally a strong supporter of everything that looks at how organizations like the League and individuals like those who are on our webcast today have reason for hope rather than that of a sense of doom and gloom. How do you see us standing up against some of what's happening throughout this country and in Michigan itself to make sure that we do have that level playing field and that voting rights are accessible and available to all of us?
Well, first, Joan, thanks for having me, and thanks to the League for asking me to join you all. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak with you. It's a great pleasure to visit with some people who maybe I got to meet in person when I had the pleasure of visiting Ann Arbor maybe about a year and a half ago when I spoke at Literati Bookstore. Had a great meal at Zingerman's beforehand. So enjoyed my time, and so it's a great pleasure to be able to chat with you all. I'm generally an optimist, I think, and as an outlook, and I think we have to be optimists to sustain our democracy. You know, if you think about where we started as a democracy, where the only individuals who could vote were white male property owners over 21 years, we've come a long way. The League, what a great organization, stemmed out of, obviously, as you know, the push for women's suffrage 100 years ago. And so, or a little over 100 years ago. And so I think what we have to think about is that voting rights has always been a push and pull between expansion and retraction. And what we're seeing right now in this period is those two things coming sort of ahead with each other at loggerheads, where you have great expansions like Michigan had with the redistricting commission. And I think, Michigan's going to have much fairer maps now that the redistricting process is about to start because of the independent redistricting commission. The state is roughly, generally speaking, about 50-50 in terms of Democrats, Republicans, but the legislature has not reflected that. And I think that the independent commission has a great opportunity to rectify that. But you also see retractions, right? And people trying to pull back on the right to vote. And so what we need to do is not just fight back against the restrictions. I mean, that's part of it. And as we see these new restrictions crop up, I know there's a new proposed bill in the Michigan legislature that does a lot of negative things. We also have to focus on the positive voting rights enhancements. And that's not to say you have to do one over the other, but too often our conversations, I think, have been about combating voter suppression and not enough about enhancing voter access. And so the reason I'm optimistic is because I think we can include that second part in the discussion and really lead to great outcomes with respect to voter turnout and voter inclusivity.
Okay. What we saw, and thank you for that, because we have come a long way from the very beginning. Even when the right to vote passed finally for women, it didn't mean all women. It took almost another 100 years for all women to be included in that right to vote. So we have gone, it's a pendulum swing. And we see pendulum swings in almost every piece of legislation till we come to a middle ground that seems to suit us all and move us forward. But of concern in these 39 votes, 39 pieces of legislation in Michigan, are things like handing over a decision about whether or not ballot drop boxes can be in cities to an unelected group of officials, the Board of County Canvassers, really concerns me and the rest of the league, because it's removing from political oversight, governmental oversight, like from the Secretary of State, the opportunity for people to have an open access to voting. What do you think about that?
Well, this is a complicated problem, and it's a problem that endures with respect to who should have the ability to dictate our election rules. We're the only modern democracy that has partisan elected officials run our elections. And if you think about it, it's pretty absurd. So, imagine if you had the big Michigan-Ohio State football game coming up, and yet Ohio State got to choose the referees, and the referees were all big Ohio State fans, right? No one would think that would make any sense. No one would think that's fair. And yet that's essentially what we do with American elections. And what I'm particularly concerned about in this new round of election laws in 2021 is taking away authority from local election workers to place it entirely within the legislature. And of course, the legislature is the body that is most self-interested in the ways in which we run our elections. And, although I think that the Board of County Canvassers has its own problems with respect to the appointment of explicitly partisan members for the board, at least you have a bipartisan board that is supposed to regulate the rules. But when you have the thumb on the scale in favor of one side because the legislature is saying so, then you sort of double down on that problem. I'm also concerned about just getting good dedicated and knowledgeable people to take these positions, the administrative positions of election workers, separate from the partisan role that some states like Michigan have. There's been this big push to have more oversight over local election workers. And that's really concerning because, for one, these are dedicated public servants, and you see many of them retiring because of the turmoil of the 2020 election. And then you have new laws like in Iowa and Texas and Florida that are actually going to penalize these individuals if they go do something that's contrary to the new restrictive law. Iowa says that election officials are subject to felonies if they violate some of the new rules. Texas, Florida, in the law that just passed the Florida Senate last night and goes to the governor's desk, would subject election officials to fines of $25,000. And it's crazy to penalize these individuals who are really the lifeblood of our democracy, really the lifeblood of protecting the right to vote, through these kinds of sanctions, and people aren't going to want to do it. So it's a multifaceted problem and multifaceted attack on our democracy. On the one hand, you're taking authority away from the nonpartisan or at least the professional election workers, placing them in the hands of partisans who don't have the same kind of expertise, aggrandizing power within the legislature, and then criminalizing or putting huge fines on local election officials as well. And that's been really underreported aspect of many of these new laws. Now, I haven't looked at the Michigan law specifically to see if it also imposes penalties on local election officials, but certainly the ones in Texas, Iowa, and Florida have done so. And that's really concerning. And so, one thing we need to push back on in terms of voter suppression is getting away from this notion that it's okay for partisan officials to be the ones that run our elections. Why would we let Ohio State choose the referees?
That's interesting. And I guess I didn't think about how partisan we are in our elections. Have we always been that way?
Well, I mean, in part, yes. And, you think about the way in which we had elections run in, the founding, often we didn't have very many elections. You think about the presidential election, it was the state legislature that simply declared who they wanted to award their electoral college votes. So, as the court said in Supreme Court said in Bush v. Gore, history has favored the voter. But we've always, we elect tons of offices. We elect in Kentucky, we elect the coroner in a partisan race. Now, I don't know what the difference is between a Democratic and a Republican coroner, but it's an elected partisan race that people seem to care about. We elect, in my view, probably too many offices, and I'm someone who's huge pro voting rights. And the people who run our offices have, generally speaking, been partisan or at least elected because of that history of electing local officials.
Okay. Yeah. Let's take a few of the pieces of legislation and pick them apart just a bit. SB 310 bans the Secretary of State or any clerk from mailing an absentee ballot application without a request. And it bans a link to the absentee ballot application on the Secretary of State's website. How do you think that affects whether or not people will have access to absentee ballots?
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, why are we shutting off an avenue to make it easier for people to cast a ballot when there's zero evidence whatsoever that those mechanisms lead to any kind of fraud? Now, I know Jocelyn Benson, the Michigan Secretary of State, very well. I consider her a friend. I've known her for years. She was an election law professor before she was Secretary of State. And although she is elected in a partisan office as a Democrat, because that's the way that Michigan, like most other states, have decided who the chief election official should be. I really think she's worn a nonpartisan hat in the way in which she's administered the office, favoring the voter while also making sure that the elections are secure. I can say the same thing about Republican Secretary of State Michael Adams here in Kentucky, who I've had the pleasure to work with. And so the question then really is, why are we taking authority away from an individual who, even though they are elected as a partisan, have really engaged in that office in a nonpartisan way to make it easier for voters? Your explicit question was, do I think this is going to make it harder for people to access absentee balloting? Of course, right? Because anytime that you take away something that people had used, makes people jump through additional hoops. Why on earth would we say you couldn't have a link on the website to request an absentee ballot? The only reason I could think of is that we don't want people to vote. And of course, that goes contrary to our history. So, it's a retaliation against more people turning out in Michigan. It's a retaliation because some people in the legislature weren't happy with the results of some of the elections. Anytime we're enacting laws like that, because of what happened, because of the results in the previous election, you've got to have a lot of skepticism as to what the motivations really are.
The other one that troubles me is SB 285. It would require a registered voter to submit a copy of his or her driver's license or state ID with an absentee ballot request. I can't think of any reason that makes sense either. Suppose somebody, I live out in a small rural community in the southwestern portion of Washtenaw County. We have no public transportation out here. I have a small community, and so it is unlikely that the clerk's office is going to be open more than a couple of hours a week, if I can get there, if I don't drive, so that I could register in person. If I'm elderly and no longer drive and have to get a voter ID and need to get from this small rural area to a Secretary of State's office to do that, just to make sure I can ask for an absentee ballot, and I have to ask for it every year under what they're hoping will pass in the state legislature. How does that impact us?
So, the question of voter ID laws in general, and then this new push to require photo IDs or some sort of identification for absentee balloting is perhaps they're slightly different questions. And then you also brought up the need to request an absentee ballot every time. So, you sort of have a couple different things embedded within this new proposal. So let me say something that might actually be a little bit controversial among the league's members, but hopefully some food for thought. So I oppose photo ID laws for voting. They do no good. That's not the controversial part. They do no good. They harm voters. They make it more difficult for people to participate. And there's no reason for them. There's no fraud that occurs that would be stopped through a photo identification law, either for in-person voting or for absentee ballot. But guess what? Here's sort of the realization I've come to over the past several years. Photo ID laws are popular. People like them. They make people think the system is a little more secure, and they're not going away. We're simply not going to be able to combat a photo ID requirement as a general matter. So here's where I think we should focus our energies. I think we should find ways to work with those who are promoting photo ID requirements to temper them as much as possible, to make sure that there's enough fail-safe measures within the law so that people aren't cut out, and then also use that agreement to achieve other voter reforms that are pro-voter mechanisms. So what do I mean? So as I mentioned, I worked with the Kentucky Secretary of State on a bunch of initiatives over the past couple of years. His big platform when he ran for office was photo ID for Kentucky elections. Our prior election law said that a voter had to show something, but it could be a utility bill or even a credit card with your name or personal recognizance if the poll worker knew you. He wanted to make that a photo ID requirement. But instead of opposing it as strongly as I could and using whatever platform I might have to oppose it, I said, okay, I disagree with you. I think this is completely unnecessary. It's going to make our elections worse off. But let's work together to figure out what flavor of photo ID law could go through that would provide enough fail-safe mechanisms so that virtually no voters would be disenfranchised. Hopefully 0 voters would be disenfranchised. And what did we do? Well, the law that passed, I would argue, is one of the mildest forms of photo ID in the country. Lots of kinds of IDs count. It doesn't matter if your ID is expired. It includes various ways. It includes the personal recognizance if you know the poll worker. And if you show up and don't have an ID, you can fill out a 1-page form under penalty of perjury that says, I don't have an ID because I have a reasonable impediment. And you can cast a regular ballot just like everybody else. So in many states, if you show up without the ID, you have to cast a provisional ballot. In Kentucky, we made it so that you don't have the ID, you fill out that form, you're put in with every other voter and don't have to do anything else. And then when the state created the absentee ballot portal, the online portal to request an absentee ballot, it asked for your ID information, asked for your driver's license information. But if you say I don't have one, then you can basically fill out that 1-page form on the web, it says, do you have a reasonable impediment? What is it? Click here, affirm under penalty of perjury that you have reasonable impediment. So there's very few voters that are going to get swept up in this photo ID requirement. The side that's promoting it gets to say, look, we got a photo ID law and help their base. And yet we have a law that I think is as good as it possibly can be if we're going to have a photo ID law, which I think, again, they're not going away. So and then what do we do? Then we took that and then said, okay, well, and the Secretary of State had the legitimacy because he had gotten photo ID as he promised, and then he was able to get voter reforms, expanding early voting. And so it turned into kind of a package, which is why I think we became a national story. New York Times wrote us up, became a national story of bipartisan election reform. So in terms of the Michigan requirement for photo ID of absentee voting, my question would be, okay, if it's inevitable, I mean, you can fight it, but maybe it's going to be inevitable. If that's the case, what can you do to try to influence the changes in the law to make it, for example, that anyone without an ID can fill out a simple form and cast a regular ballot just like anybody else? And I think, honestly, in this age where there's so much disinformation and there's so many people questioning the legitimacy of elections, that's the better path forward.
Okay. That makes sense. And some of that is, I remember from reading Vote for Us that you tell stories about just exactly how you influenced in different ways. And I guess that's part of what we need to hear, because these pieces of legislation are likely to go through. The governor is likely to veto at least a portion of them, but they'll come back again. And so you're encouraging grassroots organizations and individuals like us and voters, not politicians, to look at it in a somewhat different fashion and to fashion exactly what you just said, a look at how we might negotiate and live with something that on the face of it seems to us to be so offensive. Can you talk about one or two of the stories that you tell in the book? Because I suspect not everybody's read it, and they are empowering. You did find ways to work through the issues. And I think that's going to mean a great deal to us in the next couple of years.
I think that's right. And what you said, I think there's two aspects of what you said which are really worth emphasizing. One is that individuals have so much power to have an influence and by telling their own stories, they can change hearts and minds. But also that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And that, I'm not happy that we have a photo ID law in Kentucky, but I'm much happier than had it been the law that was initially proposed. And it went through tons of changes between its proposal and its final passage, thanks to that exact kind of advocacy that you mentioned. One of my favorite stories from the book is what I opened with. And it's about an individual who committed a crime when he was 18 years old. He made a stupid mistake. He decided to break with his brother, broke into an auto salvage yard and stole a car stereo. He was caught. He was convicted. He initially got probation, but he was working a third shift, and so he violated the terms of his probation by coming home late. And so he ended up spending, I think it was about 9 months in jail. And he got out, and then he basically said, "What are you doing with your life? This doesn't make sense. This isn't who you are. You need to clean things up." And so he did. He met a woman and got married. He got a job. Well, he tried applying to jobs, but he had a hard time getting one because at the time you had to check a box if you were a felon in most job applications. So he ended up finally getting a job as a computer technician, essentially, and then he opened his own computer repair shop. Then he decided to go back to school for physical therapy. He had 5 kids, 4 girls and a boy. As he said, I always wanted a boy, but the girls came first. But as he told me, he didn't feel like he was a real part of the community because he wasn't able to vote. And Kentucky was one of the states at the time, and it still is, even though we have a good executive order currently, but Kentucky was one of the states that banned felons from voting for life, banned individuals with felonies for life. And of course, we know the disproportionate effect this has on racial minorities as well. Well, Kentucky was considering a bill to allow some low-level felons to get an expungement of their records after a certain amount of time. And there are Republicans on the committee considering the bill who were vehemently opposed. And they said, look, they did a crime, they violated the social contract. Why should they get any leniency? We don't want them deciding who should be elected. They're going to vote for people who are not consistent with following the laws. But this individual went to testify before that committee, and he spoke for just about 2 minutes. He's really soft-spoken, big guy, kind of looks like a teddy bear, but really soft-spoken. And he told his story. He introduced himself, and he said, 30 years ago, I made a mistake, a big mistake, and I've been paying for that mistake over and over again. What more could I possibly do to be treated like my neighbor? What more could I possibly do to be treated like you in the legislature? I just want to have an equal voice in my society. And you know what? That 2-minute speech changed minds on that committee. And a staunch pro-law and order conservative Republican started texting his fellow legislators during the meeting saying, we've got to change this. And they did change it. And they passed the law that let some former felons get an expungement of their records, which would include the restoration of their right to vote. Now, it's not enough by any means. There's so much more we could do, and we need to end the lifetime ban and all the hoops that many people have to jump through in many states to regain the right to vote. But this little step of just allowing some people to get an expungement of their records can snowball into bigger things. And now there's conversations about a state constitutional amendment to allow former felons the right to vote. And it all was because of one individual who stood up and in his quiet voice told his story. And I love that because it really encapsulates the ability to change minds by telling people how this affects them directly.
And that fits well. But that story and the others in the book fit well with the final chapter in the book, which is the perils of always playing defense. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I feel like we do all the time in the voting rights world is play whack-a-mole against the latest voting transgression that the entrenched powers, those in office, are erecting. And they have their own self-interest in mind, as we talked about before, right? Their goal is to win re-election, and they like the current system, usually because it's what they won under. And so they either want to keep the current system or make the system a little bit more like it was when they won office. And so we spend so much energy filing lawsuits, so much energy advocating against these bills, and all that is vitally important, right? I'm not trying to say that we should stop engaging in those kinds of efforts and activities. They're really important for effectuating the right to vote, for ensuring fairness in our system, to try to ward off the bad laws. But I think we don't do enough in terms of trying to promote what I call pro-voter policies. So things like expanding absentee or mail-in ballots, right? You look at states like Oregon and Utah, one so-called blue state, the other so-called red state, that have their elections almost entirely via the mail. And there's no fraud there, and turnout is really high. It just makes a lot of sense. Things like same-day voter registration, which I know you all have, which, if you look at the states in terms of turnout, states with same-day voter registration have the highest turnouts. States with voter registration deadlines of 2, 3, even 4 weeks before the election have the lowest turnouts. And so what I advocate for is to flip the narrative. We think about fighting back against a restriction on voter registration, but instead, why don't we fight forward towards breaking down that barrier and finding ways to get greater voter engagement? In the book, I talk about, I say 90% turnout. Why can't we have 90% turnout? Why not strive for that? Maybe we're never going to get 100% turnout, but why don't we strive for something like 90%? Right now we typically have about 60%, which is great. In the 2020 election, it was more like 65, 66%. That's great, but that means that a third of the eligible electorate didn't show up. And there's something wrong in our democracy, I think, if we are complacent or if we're celebrating greater voter engagement or turnout when the reality is that a third of the eligible electorate did not show up. And that's just in the presidential election. The book talks about lots of reforms that we could think of with respect to enhancing voter engagement and bringing more people into the fray, including thinking about reaching out to youth, including civics education, including the registration process and the voting process, including fixing redistricting and campaign finance. All of these things we think of as ways that we need to fight back against voter suppression, but I think we should, in addition, think about them in ways that consider voter expansions.
Thank you. I'm mindful of something in a book that you were the editor for, and I think the title is Election Law Stories.
Yep.
So I hadn't thought about that, and I don't know why I didn't know it, but one of the authors reminded us that we didn't have one person, one vote until 1964. I find that astounding, and yet it resonates with what you're saying, that piece by piece by piece, by telling the stories, by moving us forward, that's what happens. Are you, is that something that you can talk just for a couple seconds about? I think that helps enlighten us about exactly what you said at the beginning, that we've always gone back and forth and made great strides and going backwards. But 1964 was when the Supreme Court said one person, one vote.
Well, let's make sure first we all understand what that phrase "one person, one vote" means, because it's thrown around a lot, I think, without people recognizing the context in what it means. One person, one vote means that election districts, and it's a redistricting term, election districts have to be roughly the same size. So if you're talking about a legislature and you have you're drawing up the districts in a state, each state has to have roughly the same number of people, because it should take 51 people to elect someone from a city, just like it takes 51 people to elect someone from a country if each district has 100 individuals. And the problem was that even though the Constitution requires a census every 10 years, states for many years, particularly in the South, had not redrawn the lines. And so you had these huge geographic districts in rural Alabama, as well as these big districts in the cities. And you had so many more voters in the cities, in the city districts, than you did in the country districts, which gave those country districts greater power, right? Because it took fewer people to elect someone to the legislature from the country district than it did in the city district. And of course, there are racial undertones for that as well, because you have more racial minorities living in the city. So one person, one vote simply means the value of my vote is the same as the value of someone else's vote when I'm voting for someone in the same body. So voting for someone in the same legislature, the same city council, or what have you. But recognizing that the court said that in 1964 in the case, well, first of Baker versus Carr, it was the first case where the court basically opened the door to hearing claims about redistricting, and then Reynolds versus Sims, the case in which the court laid down the rule that trees don't vote, geography doesn't vote, people vote, and so each district should be roughly the same size in terms of population. What that shows us is, in part, that the Supreme Court had not been protective of the right to vote before that. There was cases where the court said there is no right to vote protected by the U.S. Constitution. And it took that, what was often referred to as the reapportionment revolution of the 1960s, for a series of cases to recognize not only that one person, one vote principle, but just the fact that the US Constitution can be used to protect the right to vote. And so you see this push and pull. Unfortunately, the court has pulled back on that protection in recent years. And even though it still recognizes now the protection of the right to vote under the federal Constitution, the test it uses is much less stringent. So states have a lot more leeway. The thumb is on the scale of states now with respect to regulating the right to vote. But that wasn't the case in the 60s. And so you do have this back and forth, but ever forward marching, as Dr. King, who said the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, long but it bends towards justice. And I think that's the same with the right to vote as well.
So we have come a distance, haven't we? I mean, if the trees used to count as much as the people, sort of in a funny way, we have moved forward. And there are reasons to look at this in a more positive fashion and to garner the support of people who have stories to tell that can impact the legislation, which is what you are a proponent of, rather than always playing defense. That's very helpful to me. I hope that it is to the people on today's Zoom meeting. Why don't we take some questions, if that's okay with you, unless there are some things you still, I'm sure there are 1,000,001 things you can talk about. But if it's okay with you, we'll take some questions. And
yeah, let me add one thing. Let me add one thing before we do the questions that I think goes to what you just discussed, and then certainly would love to answer questions. The other thing we didn't really mention that goes as part of the story is the value of local laws and local grassroots activity to achieve big change. Most of our big voter movements, and women's suffrage is a great example of this, started at the local level first. It started with town meetings, of course, you all know, but it also started with laws for allowing women to vote in school board elections or in local elections. And then finally, some states allowed women to vote, and that finally culminated in the 19th Amendment. And if you look at all sorts of voting rights enhancements, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, same kind of story, where it was local movements. And so I look at things like redistricting reform and independent commissions, which really started at the local level in many places. Campaign finance reform and public financing, again, was a local push for local elections first. So it's a combination of these amazing stories. I call them democracy champions in my book. These heroes of democracy who are fighting, but they're doing so at the local level, and that can have a lot of power, right? Often we want to go to the, from the top down, and HR1, people are talking about in Congress, has a lot of great stuff in it. But actually, what HR1 has is stuff that's already been implemented in lots of places around the country, both at the local and the statewide level. There's not very many new ideas in HR1 that aren't really being used to success somewhere. And so the power of local movements, I think, is something that a group like yours really needs to focus on. And because you can have, sometimes you can have even a lot more influence on your local government and the way in which that the local elections are run, perhaps even more so than the statewide or national elections.
Thank you. The sun just came out here, and I think it's in large measure to this conversation because it does chase some of the doom and gloom that we've been feeling. I truly appreciate your efforts at this and your wisdom in looking at it from a whole different perspective and putting it back in the hands of those of us who might have a story to tell or an impact to make. So let's go now to some questions, because I see a whole lot of burning questions here. I appreciate your time. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure.
First question. Michigan's election administration is very partisan. Secretary of State, county clerks, and all township clerks are elected partisans. Is Josh suggesting that the Secretary of State should not oversee all election activity?
Well, I mean, I think that if we could start over in a sense, we would want to have a nonpartisan election board regulate our elections, with election professionals. That's what is done in other states. You look at the United Kingdom with its Electoral Law Commission. You don't have these partisan officials who are in charge of elections. But given it's the system that we have, that I think that when voting for Secretary of State candidates, we need to forget or try to forget their partisan hat, instead listen carefully to the way in which they'll approach their job in a nonpartisan way. I have every confidence and faith in Jocelyn. I think she's an incredible advocate for our democracy, an incredible advocate for the right to vote, and she doesn't care in terms of the role of her office, who wins. She wants to run the best kinds of elections. So, if we can't redo and change the structure in which we have our election administration, then I think, I'm not suggesting that she shouldn't have the powers of her office, but, think about what Brian Kemp in Georgia did when he was Secretary of State, and really did abuse the power of his office to help his side in his own election campaign. And so what I would say is that we need to focus on trying to make sure and insulate that office to try to make it as nonpartisan as possible, even in this system that is full of partisanship.
Next question. Could Josh explain how ranked choice voting would work in elections? Would this work better for local elections, or can it also be possible for state and federal elections?
Sure. Now, I know the league has not taken a position on ranked choice voting, so I'm not speaking on behalf of what the league's views might be. I do have a chapter in my book about ranked choice voting, and so I'm speaking solely in my personal capacity here, and not on what the league's view is. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with that. So ranked choice voting is a system in which, instead of choosing one candidate for office, you rank order your preferences. I like this person first, this person second, this person third, and so on. And the ranking system essentially figures out who should win. Importantly, and we could talk about the logistics and the technicalities of how that works if you want, but importantly, you couldn't have a candidate win without at least 50% support of some of the voters, because you're going to get, the first place choices, perhaps if you don't have 50% just of those, maybe you'll get some of the second place votes and the third place votes, et cetera. If the person, so let's say I vote for 3 people, if my top 2 people are on the bottom, and so they get eliminated, then my third choice counts instead, essentially is how it works. This can really transform campaigns, and we've seen it happen at the local level in places like San Francisco and Berkeley, California, and in places in Maryland, in places in Maine. Portland, Maine used it, Minnesota, in Minneapolis and St. Paul have used it for their local elections. The reason it can transform campaigns is because it makes them much less likely for them to go negative. And the reason for that is, if I'm campaigning for one of these offices, I want your first place vote. I want you to list me first. But if you really like some other candidate, I at least want you to list me second. And so it's probably not a smart strategy for me to throw mud at my opponent, because I'm going to alienate that person's supporters and probably not get their second choice vote instead. What this also does is eliminates the feeling that I'm a spoiler, right? That I have to choose between the lesser of 2 evils, or that by voting for a third candidate, I'm basically acting as a spoiler. And so I do think this can be a very powerful tool, and we've seen it be a very powerful tool in cities all over the country, and it's spreading even more. A bunch of places in Utah are about to adopt it. And this is a great example of a local grassroots reform. Ranked choice voting was actually used decades ago in places like Cincinnati, but then it got out of use. But the modern use of it started just a handful of years ago in San Francisco, thanks to a guy I profile in my book who wanted to promote the idea. So we went to bars around the city and gathered the attention of the crowd and said, "Hey, everyone, let's rank order our favorite beers," just to prove how easy it was to do and how much common sense it made. And then San Francisco adopted it, and then it spread to other places, and then now Maine uses it in statewide elections.
Next question. Another big problem with the current proposed Michigan Senate bills is that it bans the current Michigan photo ID affidavit for not in possession and requires the voter to use a provisional ballot.
Yes, I'm not sure what the question is there, but it highlights the problem of the Michigan bill as compared to, for example, what I described in Kentucky, where if you don't have an ID and you fill out the form, you can vote a regular ballot just like everybody else. And the online portal also, it does ask for your ID information, and that helps the state track that you've requested a ballot. But if you don't have one, it's a very easy 1-page screen to fill out to be able to then request your ballot.
Next, can you talk about how effective it can be to be proactive or play offense for voting rights by amending state constitutions? What words are needed to assure voting is recognized as a fundamental right that can't be fiddled with? For example, free and fair elections, or what?
That's a great question. So a little bit of background, and I see there's another comment in the chat that sort of mentions this, because I mentioned it. The US Constitution does not explicitly protect the right to vote. So there's a handful of times where the right to vote is mentioned in the US Constitution. And in particular, we think of the 4 amendments that mention voting, the 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th. The 15th prohibits discrimination in voting on the basis of race. The 19th, of course, is women, is on the basis of sex. 24th is inability to pay a poll tax. And 26th is age 18 or older. But importantly, those amendments do not say these people can vote. Those amendments say states may not discriminate on that basis, meaning that you can't deny the right to vote on the basis of race, sex, inability to pay a poll tax, or age. But nowhere does the US Constitution say that there is a right to vote. Instead, the court has found protection for the right to vote under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Basically said, when offering voting opportunities or when setting up elections, states have to ensure equality. And the court has breathed life into the Equal Protection Clause by saying it protects the fundamental right to vote. But almost every state constitution does protect the right to vote in the state constitutional language. It's 49 of the 50 state constitutions have a provision that explicitly says something like all voters in the state, or all individuals in the state shall be voters, or every citizen is a qualified voter, some sort of affirmative language that protects the right to vote. The only state constitution that doesn't is Arizona's. In addition, about half the states have language in their state constitutions saying that elections must be free and equal, or free and fair, or free and open. And the state constitutions there are used to say, is basically an additional level of protection for the right to vote. So I'm not sure necessarily that states need new language in their state constitutions as much as state courts need to actually use that language and understand that it goes beyond the US Constitution. There's been a tendency in some state courts to say, we're going to use the same test that the US Supreme Court uses for the right to vote to construe our own state constitution. And I think that makes very little sense, because the US Constitution, as we've discussed, does not explicitly confer the right to vote, but state constitutions do. So it makes little sense to use the test that we apply for the US Constitution, which doesn't have the right to vote explicitly in it, to analyze the state constitutions that do explicitly have the right to vote in it. And we have seen some state Supreme Courts do this in cases out of Missouri and Arkansas, or a couple that come out off the top of my head, where the courts have said, yes, our state constitution goes beyond the federal constitution and robustly protected the right to vote. And then for the states that do have that free and open or free and equal language, I think that's very helpful. And we've seen states like in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania courts use that language to strike down redistricting maps that are widely gerrymandered, partisan gerrymandering. So I think better than adding new language to state Supreme Courts, to state constitutions, would be to get judges who recognize the language that's already in the Constitution, the state constitution, and robustly use that.
Yes, and I just noticed, Joan, that you had put something in the chat about Bridge Magazine. Could you just talk about that briefly?
I'm just noting where people can find more information about 39 pieces of legislation at the League of Women Voters website, of Michigan's website, at Bridge Magazine, and at the Secretary of State's office. Thanks.
Next question. What have we got next, Mary Ellen?
What are the constitutional bases for protecting one person, one vote?
Well, it's really the Equal Protection Clause, and that's in those cases from the 1960s, that Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims. The court said it's not fair to let only a few people in the country elect a person for the state legislature, but you need many more people in the city. Think of it this way: a district, if it's drawn just based on geography, might have 1,000 people in the city in that district and 100 people in the country district, because they're the same size geographically. Well, that means it only takes 51 people to elect someone from the country district, and it takes 501 people to elect someone from the city district. So the value of the vote from someone in the countryside is worth just so much more. They have so much more power because it takes fewer of them to elect someone to the state legislature. And the Supreme Court said that violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. It's not treating voters equally. And that is the basis for where the court recognized the right to vote under the Equal Protection Clause.
I think we have time for maybe one more question while we're still live. Mary Ellen, if you've got another.
What are some of the most successful local initiatives you've seen implemented across the country?
Well, I talk a lot about them in my book. Not to have too much of a shameless plug, but there's a whole bunch of great things that we've seen that get implemented at the local level and then spread to other cities and then eventually statewide. So there's a phrase I like to use. There's a Supreme Court case where Justice Louis Brandeis said that states are laboratories of democracy, that a courageous state could try something new, and if it works really well, it'll spread to other states. And I like to say that if states are laboratories of democracy, then cities and counties are test tubes of democracy that can try out measures at the local level and see what works. So we could talk about lowering the voting age. We could talk about registration reform, felon reenfranchisement, election day processes, helping voters with disabilities, and some of the local measures that have been used in some places to help voters with disabilities. Redistricting commissions, how to draw the lines for city council. Though the independent commission started first with local elections in California before spreading statewide. We could discuss again campaign finance reform and public financing. You know, the Portland, Maine model. Seattle's a great example where Seattle has what's called democracy vouchers, where every voter in the city is given a government-issued voucher. They're given 4 vouchers of $25 each to give to candidates running for local office. And so candidates campaign for votes, but they also campaign for democracy vouchers that then they can turn into the city for public funding. And it's a really innovative way to lower the influence of wealthy interests in local elections. And then civics education, I want to mention again, as you really hope happening at the local level and is really part and parcel of this fight for the right to vote. So there's lots of great initiatives at the local level, and I think we can use local elections to try things out and see what works best.
Thank you so very much. I don't know about the rest of you, but I think if we were in person, we'd have a standing ovation. So let's give a round of applause, at least silently. And thank you, Professor Douglas. Dee is going to take back over. And I know, Dee, that you're going to suggest that perhaps people might stick around and ask even more questions for a little bit.
Right, and we actually have time for more questions or comments right now in chat while we're still recording. So if you gave up because you heard, oh, we have to stop now, we don't. So if there are any other questions, Mary Ellen, do we have anything from Facebook or anything else in the chat?
No, we have no more questions in chat or on Facebook.
Okay, so Josh, do you have some closing words for us, and then we will stop the recording, and then you'll be able to hear from some of the people whose names you have seen here.
So, you know, when I wrote my book, I was thinking about, you know, who is the message for? Who's going to read this book, and who's going to be someone who's inspired? You know, it's funny. When I went to various publishers, I got a lot of rejections at first because the message was people don't want to read people don't want to read good stories. People are feeling down and out. No one's going to buy this argument that there's some good news out there. Doom and gloom sells, and the anti-doom and gloom does not sell. And I disagreed with that. I thought, no, there are people and there are groups out there who really do need a lifeline of hope. Yeah, people might be feeling down and out about the state of our democracy, but that doesn't mean we should throw up our hands and say, well, the heck with it, and go hide in our holes. We need to get out there and continue to advocate for the democracy that we love. And I think there's no better group than the League of Women Voters to espouse that kind of message. And that's why, in fact, I went to the then president of the League and asked if she would provide a blurb for the book, which she so graciously did. And so the League, basically endorsed the book as a nonpartisan, positive discussion of where we go right now. And I'm so grateful for the League president for doing that. But I'm also grateful, in 2019, I was able to travel all over the country to talk about the book, including, as I mentioned, in Ann Arbor. And the crowds of people just like yourselves were so inspiring to me, because it really reaffirmed what I thought when I wrote the book, which is people do want to hear the good stories. I mean, there's got to be a little bit of skepticism, but people do want to hear the good stories as well. And you all are doing that hard work on the ground, and you inspire me to keep up this fight. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh, for joining us today. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And I want to say for myself, I feel much more positive. Thinking about voting access as enhancing voter access and working with people who may be on an opposite side, but working together somehow. And so if we can really act as if we do have, and we do have bipartisanship, that can be a very positive thing. So I really appreciate that. And those of you who are watching the program live, stick around to ask questions of Josh or make comments after we stop recording, which will be in just a minute. I would like to thank our very skillful and dedicated tech team for today's program. Our Zoom techs today are Mary Ellen Hagenauer and Linda Williams. And thanks to Susan Woolley, our Director of Communications, for all her hard work making these Zoom presentations actually happen. And I would like to thank those of you who are currently members of the League of Women Voters for your support. Whether you're currently an active member who has volunteered in the past or a quiet supporter behind the scenes, we thank you so much. And if you're not a member, consider joining the League to support the essential work of protecting the right of every citizen to vote. Check out our website for now to join, lwvanarbor.org. And also check out the programs that are available. Lots of interesting things coming up. In the meantime, my friends, stay safe, stay well. See you next time.